Coming to you from the West Coast, this is PolitiCoast. Today is December 20th, 2017, and this is episode 67, our year-end finale. PolitiCoast is the #1 BC politics podcast. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you found us. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PolitiCoastPod, and support the show at patreon.com/PolitiCoast.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. As I said, this is our year-end finale. Today we're going to have a couple quick takes at the start of the show, so that then we can dive into the main part as a look back at 2017 and a look ahead at 2018 with a bunch of predictions that you can then hold us to. As always, we have to thank our premier sponsors, Lindsay Teds and Blake Hodson, for helping make the show possible. And since it's the year end, I think a big shout out to the 30 other people who give us money on a monthly basis, to everyone who listens to us, a few hundred to sometimes over 1,000 people who at least download the show. Whether or not they listen, we don't know. Thanks to everyone who follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and all the random people that we sort of have like Twitter friends now. There's definitely a like BC Poly circle of nerds like us, and that's great. And anyone else who's just lurking in the background enjoying the show. It wouldn't be possible without people listening to it. It'd be just us talking in the corner.
Yeah, I've been quite happy with how things have progressed with the show, and big thanks to all of the listeners and the patrons who've made that possible. I would not have figured we would have kind of gotten to this level so quickly, and yeah, we have them to thank for it.
Throwing off our usual format, we'll do our quick takes first. But as per usual, we have to talk about housing, and the big housing story this week was that Stats Canada and the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, CMHC, released this report and this data set on non-resident homeowners in Metro Vancouver and across the country. So we have a bit of comparative data using a definition of people who are either a Canadian citizen who no longer lives in the country but still owns real estate, or a non-citizen who owns property in Canada without living in the country as a primary residence. So it's a different definition than the foreign buyer's tax. So that creates a little bit of issue with how you sort of compare this data to what has been done in the past. But this is something that I know a lot of people have been looking for, to say, are the foreigners driving up real estate prices?
As far as the kind of main headline numbers go, it's more or less in line with some of the other data we've seen. And the definition issue has been one of those things that pops up every time one of these surveys or reports comes out. But overall in Vancouver, a total of 4.8% of residential properties are considered to be owned by a non-resident, which is broadly in line with kind of the other stuff we've seen, which kind of pegs the foreign buyers number somewhere in the 5 to 10% of the market range. So this is broadly consistent with that.
And when you break it down by type of residence, more condos, 7.9% in the city of Vancouver are owned by non-residents versus only 3.2% of single-family homes. But what's great about this data set is there's just so much there, so you can start to use it as a Rorschach test to see literally whatever you want, depending on your biases.
And that is exactly what happened, is basically everybody took this report and used it to confirm their pre-existing ideas. A bunch of people said, oh, yeah, it's 5%, not much of an issue. Can we please now talk about land use or development policies? And then a bunch of other people picked out the number on percentage of new construction, which can get up to, I believe it's 19% in the city of Vancouver. And that's new condos. Picked out that number. It's like, oh, that's the key number there that's really driving things. And basically everybody used this as a confirmation bias.
Yeah, that was one thing I saw Andy Yan pointing out in the province, was that new condo non-resident ownership number was 24% in Richmond and 23% in Coquitlam and 19% in Vancouver. He also pulled out the quote-unquote missing middle ownership number, which I don't know how it's defined here, whether it's defined the same way as the housing reset or how literally everyone else does it, but we've had that debate. They say 12.9% own the missing middle amount, which is significant. And one of his comments is that Vancouver is one of the few metros in Canada, Toronto being another one, where non-residents own more than 1%, which suggests there's at least maybe it's just no one wants to go to Montreal. No one wants to buy in Montreal, although I think it found those are rising. The numbers I did find interesting were that non-residents tend to own more expensive properties than average, especially in Vancouver compared to Toronto. Toronto's, they owned a little bit more expensive properties, so the average single detached home in Toronto is $840,000. How quaint. But for non-residents, it was $944,000. In Vancouver, the resident-owned homes are worth $1.6 million on average versus $2.3 for the non-residents.
And this actually just makes a lot of sense, because if you can own a second property, whether or not, you're Canadian or non-Canadian who's living somewhere else and buying or own a house here, or you're going to be able to afford probably slightly higher end in the market just from that fact. And that's going to kind of skew things more towards the expensive end.
It also has an almost upward magnetic force, I think some imagine, on the market. So rather than this takes the rich ones off the market so that it trickles down, it pulls the market up. And so everything gets a bit more expensive because there's competition for the top. And then Vancouver's wealthy are stuck living in the $2 million instead of the $5 million homes. And the price rates trickle down. I guess, again,
filters typically the term that's used.
That's a better way than saying trickle down.
Slightly less pejorative.
So it's good to have data here. We'll probably have to get someone, maybe Tom Davidoff again, or Andy Yan would be even fun to talk with. I know we've wanted to talk to him for a while, to maybe put this and other data in context. And as everyone has a chance to dig more into this, I'm sure we'll hear more and more about this into 2018. That's the easy prediction off right away.
Yeah, housing is not going to be going anywhere in BC politics, that's for sure. I don't know, based on the reactions I've seen so far, I don't think this report's going to settle things very much, although it should at least kind of put a damper on there's no point in building new stuff because that's all going to be taken up, which is a sentiment I've seen expressed many times, and this seems to fairly clearly show it's at most a modest minority of the new development. But it's one of those issues that gets pretty fraught, and I would not be surprised to see people double down on this, as we already have.
I want to add to this, like a metric, if we have it, of domestic speculation. How many residents have a second home in Vancouver and that kind of thing. And if we can start to put those numbers down, we can start to actually, I think, develop a full picture of the demand. And then...
Yeah, I think the foreign part of the speculation concerns a bit of a red herring. And it's pretty clear that the market is largely driven by Canadians. And they are by far the bulk of it. And, there are certainly a reasonable number of Canadian speculators in the market. So it's one of those things that... Yeah, we probably shouldn't be focusing on the foreign aspect of it, and that's one of the reasons I think the foreign buyer stats wasn't maybe the most needed policy, and, well, so far hasn't seemed to have had much of an effect, which would be broadly consistent with Canadians driving the market rather than foreign money. Moving on, we're starting to get some of the first indications of where the 2019 election's going to be like, as there's a story coming out yesterday that bunch of the conservative leadership candidates are actually facing nomination challenges, specifically Kelly Leitch, Brad Frost, and Deepak Oberoi. So Leitch was rather infamous for running with the Canadian values and playing to the rebel media crowd during the leadership race, and she's being challenged by another physician, Gillian Yates, a Harvard-educated physician who I guess feels like it's time for a change, or the article wasn't hugely detailed on that sort of thing, but yeah, she's facing a challenge. Brad Frost is facing a challenge from a local businessman, Brad Redekop.
Yeah, I found the challenger for Deepak Oberoi in a Calgary Herald article. So he was talking, Oberoi's comments were that there's this conspiracy to take him out, but it turns out the conspiracy is that Mo Amory, who was a progressive conservative MLA in Alberta from 1993 until 2015 when he lost his seat, it's a good run, is now running against him. Amory's told the Herald that he's running because he was asked to by essentially disgruntled residents who felt like O'Brien wasn't being effective or didn't really have his heart in it anymore. I guess there was a letter that came out that O'Brien actually sent to Scheer that said he wasn't interested in a shadow cabinet position after the leadership race, which you would think if you ran for the leadership and really cared about the Conservative Party, you'd want something, but maybe O'Brien doesn't see what he was selling in Andrew Scheer and is now looking for a way out. But then he's also running again in 2019 because he's up for a nomination battle.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. He's definitely kind of on the other end of the party from Scheer, so it wouldn't have been a surprise if there was disagreements over the direction of the party, and he declined a shadow cabinet position because of that.
Historically, the Conservative Party's nomination battles have been fairly limited. They have tended to keep these pretty closed. So even now, for these people to make a nomination challenge means the party had to vet them, sign off on papers, and let it all go through. It's not just, I'm a Conservative member in good standing in Calgary, Forest Lawn, or wherever Deepak O'Brien is, and I, submit my paperwork. It's, you need to put forward a pretty good case to the party of why you're challenging an incumbent. And so to see 3 run up against 3 former leadership candidates, I think that's why there's news stories about it. It's not common and it wouldn't have been expected. Trost was interesting because he actually placed 4th overall and did so on the largely social conservative base that everyone thought was gone because it's 2015, it's 2017, but is apparently a big force still in the Conservative Party. And people think those votes going over to Scheer is largely what helped him tip the balance in the last round against Maxime Bernier.
Well, that and disgruntled dairy farmers.
And between those 2 camps, which Trost is from rural Saskatchewan, it's interesting to see that someone would want to knock him off.
Yeah, so the deadline just passed for filing nomination challenges against incumbents last Friday, so this is still pretty early on, but those are, a couple of high-profile people. It's going to be interesting to kind of see whether or not they're going to be successful.
Well, and things got maybe a little bit easier for the Conservatives this week as the Ethics Commissioner, Mary Dawson, has ruled on a story we talked about, I think, in our first episode of this year, or second episode, about Justin Trudeau's Christmas vacation with the Aga Khan and his private islands. Dawson ruled that, that trip violated the Ethics Act, and also a couple other trips he did with them and some private meetings. And you can't just really characterize the Aga Khan as just your good friend.
Yeah, and that was kind of always the line of defense that was used as, I'm just visiting a family friend, no big deal, nothing to see here. It's completely irrelevant that he's registered to lobby the Canadian government and the Canadian government gives this organization a bunch of money. This is just a personal friendship that goes back a ways. But the Conflict of Interest Commissioner found that Trudeau and the Aga Khan cannot be characterized as friends. In fact, between Pierre Trudeau's funeral in 2000 and Trudeau becoming leader of the Liberal Party, they basically had no contact, which isn't a great look if you're trying to do this is nothing to do with my position and it's all about family friendships.
Anytime you win the prime ministership of a country, I'm sure all of those old Facebook friends from high school start ringing you up like, hey, Justin, remember me? We smoke pot out behind the football field. We're totally good friends. Also, I have a private island and you should come down to it. And we totally aren't going to talk about my foundation that needs more money from the government. But this basically just plays further into the weakest point for the Liberals. Their narrative that always works against them is, they're corrupt, just in league with the billionaires and the Bay Street rich folk and they just want to give handouts to their friends. And while there's no accusation here that any money changed hands or that the government gave any money in exchange following these trips, the trips themselves are questionable. And apparently were in violation.
Yeah, so Mary Dawson, the commissioner, found that Trudeau had violated 4 provisions of the Act. And a couple of the key ones there are that a public office holder should arrange his or her private affairs in a manner to prevent the office from being in conflict of interest, also appearing in a conflict of interest. And then there was the issue about flying on a private aircraft, which ministers of the Crown, ministers of state, or parliamentary secretaries and their families aren't allowed to do that without first clearing it, as well as he also violated the section of a public office holder shall recuse him or herself from any discussion, decision, debate, or vote, or any manner in which he or she would be in a conflict of interest. And I think that last point is perhaps the most damaging, because the helicopter thing is not a huge deal. Like, it's technically against the rules, but like, you can kind of dismiss as a more minor issue. But that last one about not recusing himself from decisions in which there is a conflict, I think is the key one.
So Trudeau did apologize for this. He said he was really sorry. He also promised to ask the ethics commissioner before taking any future Christmas trips, which almost, I mean, I read it and I didn't listen to his statements, but as I read it, it sounded a bit snide almost to me, like not as sincere or not as substantive of an apology as would be warranted when you are found to have broken multiple parts of a law, and a pretty important one at that. It has been a while since the trip. It's a bit frustrating probably for Trudeau that this is breaking right on Christmas Eve, essentially.
Well, if
right
anything,
after his last Christmas trip.
it's actually a better time, I think, because it's the last week before Christmas. Almost no one is paying attention to it.
I just find that it thematically fits, but I guess you're actually right. Yeah, the Conservatives are ready to go home and go to church, and the Liberals are ready to
fly off to some other billionaire's island or something. So yeah, Trudeau is wisely not going to visit the EduCon this year and staying in Canada. So it sounds like he's learned his lesson on this one, at least initially, but I think there's still some repercussions to be felt, and I expect we'll be hearing more about it in the new year.
Well, moving into our year in review, hindsight is 2020. To start off, I think we should discuss the 84 predictions you wrote down at the start of the year and judge them. We won't go line by line. We did that in a Google spreadsheet, and we can put a link to view that online to see how we scored it at least, and maybe we got a few wrong. But it was a bit tough as you decided to give every prediction a confidence interval.
Yeah, so my inspiration from this was Scott Alexander at the Slate Star Codex blog, which is, by the way, definitely recommend. You should all be reading it. Yeah, every year does a series of sometimes over 100 predictions. So I restrained myself. And yeah, just some confidence interval in which no prediction's ever going to be 100%. And yeah, the idea is you put 10 predictions at 90% confidence. You should expect to get 9 of 10 of them right. Yeah, so threw out a bunch of them, and overall, it wasn't bad. Going through this, I think was overconfident in a few areas, and the 90% confidence ones I definitely overestimated. But yeah, so a few of the highlights. I thought The Last Jedi was going to sweep the box office, and surprisingly did not break a record.
So we only have the opening weekend for that so far, and it was the second highest grossing opening weekend of any film after The Force Awakens. So it was close, and it could still, in the end, break that record, but for now we had to score it not. You were correct that electoral reform legislation didn't get through Parliament. If I wanted to be a jerk, I could say the BC Parliament did get through some legislation on a referendum, but I still gave you that point.
Yeah, at the time, it did not look like it was going to be on the table in BC.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, you said Clark would win the election with a lowish confidence, and did she? Like, how we didn't really say, we didn't define a win because it's usually pretty clear.
Yeah, I definitely intended that as a Clark is going to retain power, which, yeah, that's clearly a miss, but it was a very close miss.
She did win her seat, she did get more votes, and she did get more seats, just not enough.
Yeah. A few votes going the other way in the riding. In one or two ridings, I would have pit that one up. But yeah, I missed that one.
But you did get who won the Conservative Party leadership race correct when you picked Scheer as having a better chance than Bernier. But you put Chong in third, which was...
Yeah, that was definitely some enthusiasm on my part towards the person I wanted to win. And reality probably should have been ranked lower for sure. But yeah, I did think Scheer would kind of be that kind of gray man riding up the middle, which ultimately he was, to my disappointment.
And I guess to many people's disappointment, Nathan Cullen not only did not win the NDP leadership race as you predicted, but did not even enter it. I don't know if either of us would have picked Jagmeet Singh from January or even really known his name that well.
Yeah, I would just not have guessed that one, even if I knew Cullen wasn't going to run.
In the UK, they did invoke Article 50. I think, again, optimistically, we both would have hoped not.
Yeah, I'm going to chalk that one up to the optimism one.
And Vancouver housing prices didn't drop now, did they?
No. In fact, if anything, they continued their quite steady upwards climb.
I think I tried to put a number in the sheet if they're like 14% year over year increase.
Yeah, which I admittedly fell victim to the, come on, it can't go up any higher. This is ridiculous. But no, it kept going up.
Guess on next year for that?
Yeah, I think I'm going to change my prediction for next year, and I'll probably be over the holidays writing up another set. Maybe with this time slightly less confident on a few things.
Well, and the final one you had on the list was the Canucks winning the Cup with 90% confidence, which you did admit was optimism, wild optimism. And they didn't. Or even make the playoffs. But overall, 55, I think we gave marks for, or about 67%.
Hey, it's not bad for first go at this. We'll see if 2018 then you do better at it.
I'll put something of my own in writing rather than just in audio format.
Yeah, that was actually a suggestion we had, was to go back through the last year and any prediction we made on the show, go through it and rank it. But, well, I think we're both pretty busy to listen to 50 plus hours of audio to pull out the random predictions.
Especially in the election night stuff.
Yeah, but maybe next year we'll actually track this stuff at the time.
Let's move into a bit of the retrospective. And let's start locally. Vancouver's big story of the year, like it's been for the last several years, is just nonstop housing debates. And ultimately, I think culminating at the frustration at the by-election where the NPA knocked off a slew of challengers to get 28% of
22, I believe it was,
of 11% turnout. Enough. And it's one of those years that when you look at municipal politics and go, what really happened? Besides just a bunch of there was a housing reset, but that's a policy document that's going to sort of simmer for another few years. Nothing's really changed at transit.
Yeah, I think we'll actually see the stuff coming out late summer on that, just in time for the upcoming election. But yeah, housing, of course, dominated the local discussions. And yeah, the by-election was very clearly a pushback against an unpopular incumbent party, because Vision did not do well at all. They didn't even get a podium finish on that one.
We did, interestingly, I think, see the growth of the left parties in Vancouver with the collapse of Vision. They didn't ultimately win, but the number of votes that went to Jean Swanson, that went to Judy Graves, that even went to Pete Fry, if we want to put him there, but I don't think we do, but that went to almost alternative progressive parties in Vancouver, shows that same discontent, but just coming from a different angle than the Hector Bremner vote almost. And there's more of it. Now, what happens when more than 11% of the city shows up to vote? Maybe 25 or 30 will show up in the municipal election. Let's dream big. It still remains to be seen. We put out a poll that we'll get to later on our Twitter, and I threw Jean Swanson in there as a mayoral candidate, and that generated some excitement from some people oh, would she run for mayor?
Yeah, that one's actually, I think, more of an example on why internet polling is not very good.
Didn't get that many votes, but it got more than the others, and we'll get to that. But it was the start of a polarization almost, I think, and probably the collapse of the Vision tent.
Yeah, they're definitely facing an uphill battle next year, and would not surprise me to see them knocked off from the mayor's office and council. And for, someone on the left to pick up a couple seats. The other things, we're finally starting to get some movement on the transit file now that the provincial government's kicking in some money on that, which was announced in the final days of the Clark government before the election. And, the feds have chipped in some money, but now we have to deal with a not very transit-friendly mayor running the mayor's council, so there's movement. In theory, ground will be broken on the Broadway subway line, but who knows at this point.
These are things that are always going to be decades out, it feels like, so I guess we'll prepare to continue to be disappointed on the transit file. Well, for our third attempt to talk about British Columbia and the year that was, it was the year that the rest of the country really paid attention to provincial politics in BC, as we had a surprisingly interesting election. The year kicked off with kind of a lame duck session as Christy Clark counted down the days, I guess, until the election. She put forward a budget that was kind of uninspiring and lacked any big commitments or changes, and ran on the same kind of status quo-ism, I guess.
Steady as she goes would probably be the more favorable way to put it.
I like status quo-isms. And yet, John Horgan was able to run a campaign that was good enough to tie. And because of that tie, roughly, statistically, we didn't have a clear winner in our election, and we got to spend a summer talking about all kinds of Westminster parliamentary errata. And lo and behold, out of the long summer of speaker debates and lieutenant governor powers, we have a BC NDP government for the first time in 16 years.
Yes, and they are, of course, supported by the BC Green Party in a supply and confidence agreement. So not a coalition, but there's an agreement to work on some common areas. 10 specific points were agreed upon, and they've already started in on a few of them. But the Greens are not actually part of the government, so they get to maintain their opposition status. And I think the Green Party's kind of coming up to be a much more of an influential force in BC politics. It's kind of the other story of the year besides the change in government and the kerfuffle over whether or not that was going to happen.
I definitely agree with that. Whether the Greens can maintain and continue to grow, or whether they fly too close to the sun and burn out as a party, I think we will have to see in the next couple of years. But they've staked everything on electoral reform, and we'll get to that in the predictions round, I guess. For the year that was, the big debates, of course, were right after the election, and it became clear that the Greens and NDP had reached this confidence and supply agreement, that Christy Clark became essentially as desperate as she's ever been to cling to power, and pitched a throne speech nicknamed the Clone Speech that picked every item out of the Green and BC NDP platforms, even the ones that contradicted each other, and forced them to vote against it, which they dutifully did. And eventually it went to the Lieutenant Governor's house, where Christy Clark said, no, I know how I said publicly that I'd accept this result, but I think you should just call in another election because they don't have the votes. And the Governor General dismissed that advice, which was relatively unprecedented, not completely.
There was kind of an understanding that immediately after an election, if there's a chance for another party to form government, you offer it to them.
Yeah, and I agree with that one, but it's just the other tradition we have is the Lieutenant Governor and Governor General just does what the Premier or the Prime Minister asks, because we don't have a powerful monarchy. But it left for lots of debate about this kind of nonsense. And then the razor-thin vote margin became such an issue because, what happens when the NDP puts forward a speaker and then can't pass any votes? Well, that solved itself, as I hoped and maybe had said it would do, when Daryl Plekas, following his stabbing Christy Clark in the back at a caucus retreat, stabbed his party in the back in a dramatic vote for who would be speaker by being the only person with his name left on the ballot.
And that, of course, resulted in him getting unceremoniously booted from the BC Liberal Party over it.
Something that, as we mentioned at the time, is unprecedented as far as we know. People who become speaker don't get kicked out of their party. And even in history, not a lot of MPs or MLAs generally get kicked out of their caucus.
Especially for something like that, where it's just taking on a job in Parliament.
But the Liberals are holding their grudge and have had a very bitter session with lots of fake ministerial titles and petty battles over all kinds of words, but they're quick to blame Daryl Pleckus for all of it.
Yeah, having Rich Coleman be the interim leader, I don't think was a smart choice on their part. He's not the sort of person you want running a party.
But they had to find someone who didn't want to be involved in the race, and so I guess he drew the short straw, and now we're into a leadership race. But before we get into the specifics of that, one MLA from the BC Liberal caucus had a laundry list of ideas that he wanted to see whoever wins take up. Most famously among them was Mount Rushmore, BC.
Yeah, so Laura Throna's BC Liberal MLA for Chilliwack Hope came out with a 65-point list of things the BC Liberal Party should do, and these are policy ideas for the leadership candidates. It's a lot of kind of fairly typical stuff, continue Site C. Some of the more radical departures would be stuff like eliminating the corporate income tax. And, of course, the headline grabber was, we should carve up a mountain.
We need more public art, and we could sell the rocks. What's the downside of this idea? Like, if we had something you could park RVs on top of, it'd just be great. But seriously, we mocked this at the time, and it was one of the highlights of the year in terms of just absurd news stories besides license plate battles in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And it just led to all kinds of speculation, like, what do you carve into the mountain? Do you carve Christy Clark's face for the fun that was this year? I think his initial idea was like a globe held up by hands reaching out, but I think he admitted he wasn't much of an artist or sculptor himself. So sadly, I don't think any candidates have taken this specific platform pledge up yet.
Sadly, no one seems to really want to run on the carve faces into mountains platform.
So none of them get the PolitiCoast endorsement. But moving into the candidates themselves, the best place to probably start is to actually go to the Wikipedia page, British Columbia Liberal Party Leadership Election 2018, which we'll throw a link to in the show notes, because someone or a number of people are keeping that very up to date with all of the endorsements, proposals, and information you would need to make a relatively informed decision, which you should actually decide to do pretty quickly, because if you want to vote in this election, you need to sign up by December 29th.
Also, if you want to run, you can also still sign up by December 29th. Although at this point, we're not likely to see any late entries.
And then the voting period is going to happen between Thursday, February 1st and Saturday, February 3rd, at which point they'll announce the winner because they're doing all the voting online or by phone. So it'll be pretty quick to count up those votes.
Yeah, and this was a change from their original idea, which was do it at the same time as the Super Bowl, which they wisely decided to change course on.
So do take a look at it and get involved if you're interested at all. One of the best ways you can make a difference in democracy in Canada is to get involved in a leadership race, because these are the people who would become premier or prime minister or have a very good shot at it.
Yeah,
versus your local MLA and getting to vote for them once every 4 years.
Especially if you're in a safe seat, which isn't going to change at all.
So right now running, still in the race at least, are Michael DeYoung, Michael Lee, Todd Stone, Sam Sullivan, Diane Watson, Andrew Wilkinson. Mike Bernier dropped out fairly early or a couple months ago. I like to say it's because there were too many Mikes in the race. I think he realized his chances weren't too strong given the other people in the field. And Lucy Sager, a businesswoman from the interior, also dropped out, probably because she also realized she didn't have much of a shot at winning. So far, the race seems to be coming down to, at least from what I hear on Twitter,
because there isn't great polling out there on this.
Literally none, which is weird. Maybe we'll see an Insights West poll in the new year. If you're listening, Mario, do a poll.
Alternatively, patrons. We can really boost our Patreon numbers. We may be commissioning polls.
We could probably run a Google survey for like $500 or something. Patreon goal.
New Patreon goals. We're doing commission polls.
The wisdom of the crowd right now seems to be that Todd Stone, Andrew Wilkinson, and maybe Mike DeYoung are in the front runner category, with Michael Lee sort of nipping at the dark horse tail. But the real almost surprise disappointment so far has been Diane Watts.
Yeah, so up until recently, she was actually a conservative MP for South Surrey White Rock, which listeners of the podcast will remember just had a by-election, and that was because Diane Watts resigned her seat so she could run for BC Liberal leader, and that decision cost the Conservatives a seat, and from the looks of it, it's going to be all for naught because her campaign has largely fallen flat.
Well, Watts was a popular mayor in Surrey, but one theory I'm hearing is being a successful mayor outside of Vancouver or Toronto, where you actually have to compete, isn't actually that hard. Like, if you're a moderately decent politician, you can win that and probably be successful at it for a while. But then once you get to the federal or the head of the provincial stage, you're at a much higher caliber, and to keep up, you need to have more skills than just being able to beat, I don't know, like there was a candidate for the mayor of Burnaby who wanted to ban kissing in public. This is the competition you're in those ranges, versus here are serious politicians with teams behind them.
Yeah, it's probably also worth pointing out that Sam Sullivan, the other person most well known for being a mayor in this race, hasn't seemed to be doing that well either. So while all of the candidates have put out various policies, there's kind of been a few themes that have run through this that they all are largely coalescing around. And that largely being they need to recover the lost ground in the lower mainland, and maybe their neglect of the transit system was part of that, but a lot of them have proposed various transit policies on it. They all seem to agree they need to recapture the suburban and urban vote. And the other thing they all seem to agree on is that changing the electoral system, which the Liberal Party tried to do less than a decade ago, is a terrible idea and should be fought tooth and nail.
Yeah, some of them have been calling it the process to get there. I think we mentioned this with Dave Moscrop, is they're calling it rigged or otherwise really throwing the ad hominems at this, which feels not helpful. And not just like I would prefer electoral reform, but feels disingenuous to the point of actually undermining trust in our democratic systems. Like, I'm fine with them campaigning against electoral reform, but do so honestly. And if you think a referendum of 50% plus one is weighted too much to the people who live in cities because there are more of them, then just say that. But once you start throwing out loaded words like rigged, I feel like you're getting into the easy to call it Trump-esque kind of rhetoric, but it's that kind of inflammatory language that I don't think is helpful.
Yeah, it seems disproportionate from the actual seriousness of the policy.
When we have an example of a rigged electoral reform system, this is touching on the next topic, Canada, at the federal level, where they set up a committee to study the thing, but when it didn't give the right answer, you killed it. And that's when you knew the fix was in from the start. But at least we got to learn a lot about electoral reform. Call back to our deep dive from 2016. But yeah, otherwise this race has been frustratingly quiet at the BC Liberal leadership level. There's been a couple interesting news stories recently. There was I guess at the end of November, a group called Social Media ROI, which I can't find anything out about because when you Google social media ROI, you find all kinds of marketing nonsense because ROI is just return on investment. So,
which you think a company branding itself as social media ROI should know about, but it seems like they have a pretty terrible ROI about social media.
Well, they tried to do a scoring of the race based on media exposure, keywords mentioning each candidate, whether the candidates were using positive or negative words about each other, and just how engaged their supporters were on social media. And from that, they found Wilkinson in November overtook Diane Watts for first place. And then in third and fourth were Mike DeYoung and Todd Stone, with Sam Sullivan and Michael Lee well back from the rest. Whether that translates to literally anything, it's hard to say. Sometimes these people can be great at generating controversy on the internet and getting followers, but then not translating that to votes or members. Other times could underestimate their support. But maybe it's going to be Wilkinson, Watts, DeYoung.
Yeah, it's worth remembering that Maxime Bernier ran miles ahead of everyone else on the social media game, and it didn't end up doing him a huge amount of good.
We'll never forget the red pill memes.
Or the Mad Mats memes.
Well, since we're getting into the silly, the other endorsement I wanted to bring up is there was a story just in the last couple of days that's in Global News and a couple other places. I guess there's this group called Right Now, which is a anti-choice group, doesn't like abortions and wants to find out which politicians will bring back the 1950s era reproductive rights. And they sent a survey to all of the candidates, of whom Todd Stone and Mike DeYoung were smart enough not to reply to, and Diane Watts was clever enough as well to decline. Andrew Wilkinson replied to say he is not pro-life, which got him third place in this survey, because I guess responding that you're not in favor of their position is better than not responding at all.
It's a really weird ranking system.
Of the two, I guess, who gave them actual responses, Michael Lee told the group that he wanted to decrease sex-selective and late-term abortions and that minors should need parental involvement to get an abortion, which, for anyone who's pro-choice, is relatively alarming. It's not like U.S. reversing Roe v. Wade, but that would suggest some restrictions that, to be clear, in BC, we have a mature minor policy around healthcare decisions that mature minors can make their own without parental consent. But Michael Lee did clarify for another news article that he's not intending to legislate anything. He would prefer there to be less, but it's still a woman's right to choose. Sam Sullivan's comments were a bit more confusing, as he said he wanted to restore Christianity to a central and positive role in society, which I don't think either of us knew he was religious.
Yeah, it was news to me.
He went on to clarify in his comments, he didn't really say anything about abortion, but he just talked about how Christians are sometimes too anti-stuff and they need to be more pro-stuff. He said it better than that, but just wanted it to be less like negative and bigoted, which doesn't really answer anything about the abortion question. But that's still enough to get him second on this pro-life group list, because if you want to know who they ranked bottom as the least pro-life, that was Mike DeYoung, although again we have no clue why they rank these people that way.
Yeah, it's a complete mystery on this, and really seems to be like they were just going randomly on the who didn't answer this.
So we'll keep following the BC Liberal leadership race, and we'll get into some predictions when we get into our final segment. But maybe let's close out our retrospective with a look at the federal scene. We mentioned briefly the death of electoral reform at the national stage, and I think we've said plenty on that already, but maybe let's look at the two leadership races that happened.
Yeah, so both the Conservatives and the NDP elected new leaders. The Conservative one got a lot more attention, both because there was a whole lot more people running, and Well, because it got a little nuts at times.
It's also the official opposition, so it is a little bit more meaningful.
Yeah, because like in theory, the person who won this could quite likely be the next prime minister. I mean, it's Andrew Scheer, so almost certainly not, but in theory, that could have happened.
But I think you're right that the nuttiness of it took a bigger part of the stage. A lot of that happened in 2016, a lot of the initial Kelly Leach things, but I think the weird video
that was definitely a 2017
came out
one,
in 2017.
as was most of Kevin O'Leary's stint.
Brief stint.
Briefish stint.
The results of that were nail-biting, though. We probably thought it would be close, but I don't know how many people were predicting it would go to
the final round.
Yeah. But it took literally everyone's votes to get Andrew Scheer ahead of Maxime Bernier, and that inspires confidence.
So yeah, that happened in May. Since then, Andrew Scheer's been, I guess, leading? Is that the right verb? The Conservative Party, trying to take Trudeau down a peg or two rather unsuccessfully, as Trudeau still seems more or less as popular as before. And while there's a few minor-ish scandals, so far Andrew Scheer hasn't been able to kind of really sell the Conservatives as an alternative.
If anything, I think he's done the best by putting people like Pierre Poilievre on the attack front. So Poilievre was not many people's favorite minister when he was in the Harper cabinet, and a lot of people really hated him because he's basically an attack dog. But he works really well in the opposition, because then all he gets to do is hate on Liberals, and that's apparently why the man exists. So he's running to town with that. And when it comes to going after Bill Morneau, you have Poilievre to actually make that case. When it comes to building a platform and presenting an alternative, that's where they might run into problems. But there's been a couple good choices for the Conservatives in terms of, leading with your strengths and putting people in the right positions, I guess.
Yeah, and their shadow cabinet, has a few slightly questionable decisions, and like a lot of people raised an eyebrow at Pierre Poilievre being made finance critic, although since the Morneau scandals broke, it actually turned out to probably be a fairly decent call on that one, which I think was more good luck than strategic thinking.
Well, there's a certain amount that goes into filing all of the FOIs and doing all of the questions that you can do as an opposition, and just hounding an issue until you can generate headline after headline on the same issue. So they've done that work to their credit.
Yeah, and that's been good. Aaron O'Toole, I think, has done a pretty good job in the foreign affairs role. And yeah, so there's definitely a few things going on there, which is working for them. But I don't know, overall, I don't think they've really kind of given people a reason to support them rather than a reason not to support Trudeau.
Well, and on the same side of the aisle, I guess technically, the NDP ran through its smaller, more violently agreeing leadership debate with just 4 candidates, 5 briefly, as Pat Stogren entered and then disappeared, and we miss you, Pat, please come back, Rebel Guerrilla, as well as Bruno and a couple others who tried to get into the race and ultimately never did, and I guess didn't meet the entry fee requirements, or were just deemed a little too NDP for the NDP. But in the end, we got Jagmeet Singh winning decisively on a first round ballot, which I don't think many people were expecting. There was some thought that Charlie Angus could pull through. There was never really a clear front runner. Everyone was expecting Guy Caron to be at best a compromise candidate and Nikki Ashton to fall in last. But she did much stronger, and so Nikki Ashton actually surpassed Guy Caron, almost caught up to Charlie Angus, who I think did very well among party members, but Jagmeet Singh was able to generate enough enthusiasm to bring so many new people into the party to take him over the top, in addition to picking up some support within. But then a week or two after the NDP leadership race ended, he kind of just hasn't been heard from regularly since. He's on a cross-country tour, meeting people in social media. Just this week, his not wedding photos were up with a possible future Mrs. Singh. Did you miss that story?
I vaguely saw it and promptly ignored it.
But it's hard to say. The NDP defense is that he's out there meeting people and getting the local press, but they've slipped on by-elections where, to their credit, none of them were going to be NDP pickups, but
they still lost votes between the last election and that, which isn't a good sign on a by-election when you're in opposition.
And the polls have been pretty stagnant. You would think if you were going around generating the grassroots support and word-of-mouth support, you could have something to show for it. But so far, he's still in a grace period, I would almost say. He's got a couple more months to, I don't know, go on his tour around Canada, and then he needs to show something for it, maybe.
Yeah, I think if he is still out of Parliament by the end of 2018, things are going to start to be trouble for him on that front, as well if the NDP don't actually end up generating much buzz from this cross-country tour.
Well, he will have one possible opportunity. Thomas Mulcair has announced he's probably, or has leaked that he's probably going to resign next year, and that would open up the seat in Outremont, although I don't know if Jagmeet wants to run in Quebec, especially in a riding that is actually pretty traditionally liberal, but just went to the NDP when they got a Quebec liberal to run for them. And then it just sort of stayed with Mulcair and Layton. And whether the NDP can hold that remains to even be seen.
Yeah, that's another possible picture for the Liberals. And I expect Singh's to try and get a GTA seat.
He really seems to want to run in Brampton. I think that's what he's waiting for.
Yeah, but the longer he's out of Ottawa, the longer the kind of politics press corps isn't going to get that FaceTime and, the juicy quotes to run in their stories about whatever the latest Trudeau screw-up is. And that, I think, is going to end up hurting them in the long run.
So despite weakness on the Conservative bench and weakness on the NDP bench, the Liberals still haven't really skyrocketed this year. They've held a pretty steady lead in the polls. They haven't really gone up. They've maybe gone down a little bit at times with the Bill Morneau scandals that are still ongoing. They hurt early in the year when they dropped electoral reform, but it's not clear that had a big effect in the polls.
I think the people who were going to be angry about electoral reform getting canned, probably all 5 of them that were supporting the Liberals before have dropped their support, but everyone else has more or less moved on.
And beyond that, one of the things I've noticed is there just hasn't been a ton of legislative progress in the Liberal Party or the Liberal government. A lot of things seem to be stuck at first or second reading. Bills are still sort of chugging along. Some major pieces of legislation haven't passed through the Senate yet, and so if they hit a prorogue button over the Christmas break, that would throw it all back to first draft again. And I get that they don't want to invoke closure and be seen to do all of the things the Harper government did that they criticized them for, but at some point you do need to actually learn how to navigate bills through Parliament. This is one of the problems they had in 2016 with the whole assisted dying and the motion 6, I think it was, where they tried to rewrite the rules of the House without the other parties agreeing, and that blew up in their face. This was Elbowgate, which luckily we didn't have a repeat of. Man, 2016 was bad. But you just have all these bills not moving quickly, and then you go, what do they have to show for being in government for over 2 years now? Yeah,
they hit a few things early on, did the child benefit, the assisted dying stuff, but largely feels like they've been treading water, with the exception maybe moving cannabis and a couple other things forward. But yeah, overall, it's just not a huge amount of wins Trudeau can chalk up. And so far, his biggest 2017 success is in the category of not being Donald Trump.
Which he'll be able to run that for a while. And even if Donald Trump's gone, he won't be Mike Pence, which is just a different kind of evil. So the Liberals always have that.
And finally, we're going to move on to our predictions for what's going to happen in 2018. So starting off at the federal level, I guess, I think Bill Martineau, who's gotten quite a bit of heat in the last couple months for a couple different issues, from French villas to the Morneau Chappelle stuff, I think that's probably going to end up with him leaving cabinet.
I know I predicted this when stuff was near the peak of the fan in September or October, assuming it was quite readily about to happen. I still think it'll happen over the holidays. Be a nice time to sneak that through with hopefully not a ton of attention paid to it, but it's one that I don't feel super confident about. I think though, if he is sort of shown the back door from the cabinet room, by the end of the year we'll be hearing rumors at least that Morneau just might not be running again, and he'll find that it's much more fun being a CEO than an MP. I think we also both agree that the Liberals are going to continue to keep the lead in the poll over the Conservatives and NDP through all of 2018.
I definitely think they'll be ahead for the year. It wouldn't surprise me if we see one or two times where they actually dip below, and then we get the, oh my God, the Liberals are, behind whatever party, but I expect that's going to be short-lived.
And I think we both did a little prediction just there in the last segment that the Liberals might actually win the Outremont by-election after Mulcair steps down, since they seem to be picking up steam in Quebec and across the country.
Yeah, I think that's a likely pickup on their part.
Well, at the provincial level, here in BC, the BC Conservatives are running a leadership race.
Oh yeah, they're still a thing.
Yeah, I've seen their interim leader, Scott Anderson, tweeting about Lindsay Shepherd on Twitter, because apparently we need to worry about free speech at UBC. Specifically, he tweeted. But I think their party is going to just continue to be a joke through 2018. They're not really going to attract any notable candidates for their leadership, and will probably have someone who is at most a city councillor win.
Yeah, I could see that. On the other hand, they've at least changed their website from one of the worst things ever coded to passable. So they are making slow gains towards respectability, but it's not going to be enough for them to stop being a fringe party.
On the BC Liberal leadership race, it might just be my personal preference of the slate so far, and just bias that he was also a BC Civil Liberties Association guy, but I think Andrew Wilkinson might take it.
Yeah, I think it's going to come down to either him or Stone, and I don't really feel confident enough to pick one over the other.
Stone might have the advantage just with the number of endorsements through the interior, and I know the Liberals are doing that same kind of weight by riding vote system. But Wilkinson does have the city cred that the Liberals are missing out on.
Yeah, Stone's made some moves to kind of shore up the city stuff. I don't think Vancouver thought particularly highly of him after his stint as infrastructure and transportation minister, but he has made some noises about kind of fits in that part of it, and he's made some plays to try and shore up some of the urban stuff, and I think being kind of the lone interior voice in the campaign is probably going to help him quite a bit, because there is that regional aspect to it. And plus, fairly charismatic guy. There's enough of those kind of intangibles there that I could see it maybe being enough to kind of push him over the edge, especially compared to Wilkinson, who I don't think's had charismatic ever used to describe him.
Well, let's put it at a 90% confidence interval that a white man wins the BC Liberal leadership, with that 10% in case Diane Watts sneaks it.
I don't think she's winning.
Okay. There have been a few rumors through the fall, or not even rumors, but more just pundits needing to fill column space, saying, hey, the NDP could trigger a snap election in the spring as a way to undercut the Liberals and secure a majority. But I think those are pipe dreams, and we'll have even the Greens' incentive right now is to hold the parliament together through the end of 2018, so I don't think we're seeing a BC election next year.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. I think that would be just a dumb play on the NDP's part to trigger a snap election, because it'd be less year or so, maybe a little less since the previous election, and Canadians generally don't look at parties calling elections so soon after so very fondly.
And the NDP doesn't have a huge track record of winning BC elections.
Yeah, that's the other thing, is they don't actually generally do all that well electorally, so there isn't a great incentive to make a high stakes bet on being able to win a snap election, especially since with the current seat count, it's just as likely the Liberals pick up a few seats and then form government.
I think there's a higher chance, while we're speaking of elections, that the UK triggers a snap election, although their rules are really weird with their fixed election date. You need like
2/3 vote or something?
2/3 of the House, to vote to trigger an election, or you need to lose a confidence vote, which the Brexit deal might be now, because enough MPs broke ranks with the Conservatives in a awesome vote to force Parliament to have a say over the final deal. Whether the Conservatives are going to still have a spine at that point remains to be seen. But I think what has to happen after a confidence vote is lost is the opposition gets the chance to form government, but the numbers just aren't there in the UK for a Corbyn government to happen. But I'm always going to follow UK politics since I get to keep voting in them. But you think something's going to happen in Ontario?
Yeah, I think Canada's least popular premier is not going to win re-election. As Ontarians go to the poll next year, I'm fairly confident Patrick Brown is going to come out ahead. Of course, it is the Ontario PCs, and they seem to have this miraculous ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
It's incredible. They've blown so many elections that I kind of wouldn't be surprised if the Win machine can, just eke it out.
Like, it goes to show you how badly they do that. Kathleen Wynne was very unpopular before the last election, and the PC screwed up so badly, the Liberals went from a minority to a majority. But so far, Brown seems to be trying to learn from all of the past mistakes and go for electable over ideological or any. And I could see that being enough where they can eke out a win against, Canada's least popular premier. And the Liberals are long in the tooth there. They've basically been running Ontario politics nearly as long as the BC Liberals were running the show here, and similar sort of deal where, a whole bunch of scandals and whatnot accumulate, and they well past their best before date.
You mentioned Kathleen Wynne being the least popular. The Angus Reid did just release its poll on this, and it reminds me. And John Horgan is the second most popular premier in the country right now, after Brad Wall, as always, except for his brief dip there. But it makes me realize Wall, I think, is retiring next year, or very soon, and that could mean Horgan becomes the most popular premier in Canada. But I'm not sure how long that will last. It seems like very few people can hold that level of endearment with their voting population for too long.
Yeah, I suspect the Site C is going to come back and kind of take some of the wind out of his sails on that one, and there's probably going to be another unpopular decision made fairly soon that's going to do the same sort of thing. Not sure what that is yet, but I'm sure there will be some bloc disappointed from what's going to come out of the budget.
I think the Site C stuff is going to be mostly not blown over, but a lot of it's going to kind of be over after Christmas, and then the focus is just going to be entirely on Kinder Morgan, which he's going to fight. And even if it gets built, which I'm kind of feeling like at this point, Kinder Morgan might just throw in the towel after a little bit longer.
Yeah, I see it more as a case of, the shine's coming off him, and it's not the thing that really moves things very much, but it's going to be the start of, the end of the honeymoon period, and where the other things that inevitably result in people getting disappointed because, that's just the nature of governing, are going to maybe take their toll.
Here at the municipal level, we have a series of elections happening in October. I think it's still such a toss-up. I could see Gregor Robertson just eking out a win for the mayoralship here in Vancouver, but Vision losing control of council in a very tight three-way race for mayor, and enough go with the devil they know, but then pick all his adversaries to fill council.
Vision is definitely having a lot of problems and are, I think, also past their best before date, and the housing issue has really taken its toll, and they've been running things here since 2008, and the housing situation's gotten worse and worse, and I get the sense that Vancouverites are effectively fed up, and now it comes down to a question of who gets to fill that role, and I think this is probably going to be the NPA's election to lose. They're kind of the other main party that generally runs the show here when it's not Vision or their predecessor, I guess, Cope before the split. So I see this being the NPA's election to lose, but it's really in part going to come down to who they end up running. And so far, none of the names put forward for mayor have been particularly inspiring, particularly way on of the CPC Jesus fame. Wouldn't surprise me if the Greens pick up a second seat here. I could see Pete Fry running again and having some success there.
And if they're clever and don't run a mayoral candidate, but run a large school board contingent, a large parks board, I could actually see the Greens taking school board and parks board and a handful, 2 or 3 even, council seats based on how well they did. I think it might be a mistake for them to run a mayor, or maybe it's a good way to make sure they have the profile. But
I could see Carr being ambitious enough for her to go for it.
Should sacrifice her seat then, because I don't see the Greens winning the mayoralship. The only other predictions I'll throw out there, which are probably easy picks, are that this free speech ongoing debate continues, and it's going to continue to be exhausting and trivial, especially on Twitter. But to be more specific, we're going to see the Lindsay Shepherd, Jordan Peterson free speech tour, I bet, which will probably be at mostly Conservative Party campus student groups. And I wouldn't be surprised if at least one university shuts it down or cancels it due to security concerns or something like that. And that becomes something
that would blow up for sure.
That everybody debates for 3 weeks until the next stupid thing happens. And related to that, I think we will see some kind of major white supremacist rally, not a Charlottesville type clash, but maybe that's too easy to again. We've already seen things happen in Quebec, including the mosque shooting that was at the start of this year. But 2018 can't be that much better than 2017.
So we asked our listeners on Twitter to weigh in on what they thought of a few kind of questions and what their expectations are for the next year. So we put a bunch of Twitter polls asking about whether or not the electoral reform referendum is going to pass. 2/3 said it would, which is, I think, very optimistic on that one. And I imagine it's been the opposite to happen.
There were 56 voters on that. And like any online poll, these are completely meaningless, but just kind of fun. I voted pass. I saw one person, Bob Warwick at Warwick, actually tweeted us that the referendum would pass with 60% plus on the yes side. I'm nowhere near that optimistic. I think if anything, we're going to see like a 52 to 54% kind of victory, which then becomes very tough to act on. We asked about the BC Liberal leadership race, which frustratingly for a long period of time today was tied, or almost a 3-way tie even. We got 46 votes there, with 35% going to Todd Stone and 30% going to Wilkinson. DeYoung got 22% and Sullivan got 13%. I could only fit 4 names in there, and so I cut Michael Lee and Diane Watts just as...
Seriously, Twitter, what that, like, we can do threads now, we can do 280 characters, you can't add a 5th or a 6th poll option?
Someone was pointing out we should have done brackets, but again, we threw these together like this morning at 11, so we only had a few hours to run them. For the next mayor of Vancouver, I put Gregor Robertson, the NPA candidate, because they don't have one yet, Jean Swanson, why not, or just other. And other was doing all right this morning, and it seemed interesting, and then suddenly now we have 81 votes on that. It was our most popular poll, and Jean Swanson got 42% of the vote. So how do you feel about Mayor Swanson next year?
I think that would probably be a disaster.
Rent freeze and mansion tax.
Yeah, that's not what we need. So yeah, I think that says more about the people who followed us on Twitter or picked up your retweet of the poll than anything else. I was actually surprised that Vancouver Politics got the most responses out of this.
Yeah.
I thought for sure BC Politics would come out ahead on that one.
I think none were as captivating, like the BC Liberal leadership. None of the candidates picked it up. It was only there. I didn't tag them, which probably would have been more fun. The mayoral, if you don't trust the Swanson numbers, she may not even run for mayor. She may just run for council, having a better shot there. The NPA got 28%. Robertson got just 22%. So people are still more optimistic about the NPA than even Robertson.
Which, yeah, it's probably the right way to look at this, I think. Minus, of course, Jean Swanson's oddly high numbers. Yeah, we also asked whether or not the Green NDP supply and confidence agreement would survive to the end of the year, and most people said yes, with a whopping 81% of, 27 votes, but...
It's not the most passionate or exciting poll, I guess. People were like, yeah.
Yeah, but the result made sense, because the electoral reform referendum that the Greens really, really want, they're not going to pull the plug, and, that happens in November, and no one in their right mind would force an election during Christmas. So that basically means all of 2018, it's fairly safe, and then maybe something in 2019.
Well, you threw up two more questions about U.S. politics. When asked whether Trump would still be president at the end of 2018, 66% of 32 people said yes, which is the not optimistic, but probably realistic answer. You need a lot of things to go right to take a president out, I guess.
Yeah, either there has to be something crazy damning to come out of the Mueller investigation, where even the Republicans are shocked by it and have to boot him, which there's almost certainly a bunch of really damaging stuff, but enough to make the party break ranks with him. Yeah, that's pretty uncertain. And then even if the Democrats win back to the House and the Senate, which was our next question, that they don't actually take their seats until the very, very end of 2018 or early 2019. The Congress does it a little differently than the presidency. But yeah, once again, earliest anything would happen in 2019.
You did ask, what will the Democrats take in the midterms? And 38% of people optimistically say both the House and Senate, which is possible. I did look at the numbers beforehand. A lot of things have to go right, but
now that
fewer things have to go right now.
Now that Alabama has a Democratic senator, it makes it a little more favorable, but still, it's a very bad Senate map for the Democrats, even just at a normal time. So it's, maybe the anti-Trump sentiments will push them over the edge in a few seats, but it's going to be a tough road for them to pick up the Senate. So I actually think the House is likely just from how much backlash there is, but I think the Senate's probably going to stay Republican.
Well, and the House not Senate was 31%, and the Senate not House was 27%, and 4% of people are just either Trump partisans or super pessimistic, or...
I'm actually surprised more people aren't pessimistic on this one.
Well, we did ask people for any other predictions they had. Peter Lang at Soul Parole predicted that there will be 4 parties with seats in the BC legislature after the next provincial election, which probably won't be next year. And he thinks that'll happen whether it's proportional representation or first past the post.
That I'm a little skeptical of, just because I don't see there being another party. Maybe if PR happens, the Conservatives will be able to pick up a seat or two.
He qualifies it as, if not 4, then 3+ independents, which is technically the case right now. We have the 3 main parties and the independent speaker. And finally, on Facebook, Michael Ma predicts that electoral reform will pass, that Todd Stone wins the Liberal leadership, and that both Robertson and Hepner lose the municipal elections. So that was our year-end show and PolitiCoast for 2017. This has been an extended recording because of technical issues in the middle of it that meant we've been here for like 2.5 hours trying to record an ideally 60-minute show.
Yeah, although I have to say, this is episode 67. This is the first time we've had to really kind of do a couple passes at a segment, which is pretty good as far as podcasts go. So we've done well at that so far.
I think like episode 5 it might have happened, but
Yeah, we briefly had to re-record something when I think your phone took a call and stopped recording during our thing.
back in those days. But going ahead into 2018, since 2017 was surprisingly successful for the show, I think we do want to do more with the show. Like goals I have are definitely to do more live shows, since those were awesome fun. And I think one thing we should definitely try to do is actually break a story of our own. We don't have to like be journalists, but to have something that's not just, hey, here's us reading what we saw on CBC and spouting opinions about it, but file an FOI, which I've done and isn't hard, or run the poll. That's actually an easy one to do. We'll do something and hopefully come up with our own news analysis to tell you about. But mostly, thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you to everyone. It's been quite a year for us, and wouldn't be possible without you. And that has been PolitiCoast. Find links to the stories mentioned in the show notes at politicoast.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PolitiCoastPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/PolitiCoast. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.